What's going on YouTube? It's your boy Hercaway here, and I know I've been away for a while, but I got some awesome news. I'm going to be a father, and it's going to be a boy. Even though I've been away for a while, I had a lot of questions been thrown at me. Hey, how can you do this? How can you do that? So over the next few weeks, I'm just going to release some videos answering those questions, and hopefully I can help you out, that the viewer, which is you right now, are watching right now.
Now turn up.
One of these questions that I get asked, or not really questions, but I guess feedback that I should give back, if you want to call it that. People will send me their computer bills, and they ask me, hey, does this work? What can I do? What can I do to save money? So this is going to answer that question here. What you don't need in a gaming PC, or a, I guess, basic PC, if you want to call it. And this list doesn't mean that you shouldn't have these things. You can definitely have them, but if you're on a budget, it's just my recommendation. So the first thing is RGB. Alright, red, green, blue, whatever you want to call it. But RGB is an amazing craze that kind of took over computer builds, from the mouse to the keyboard to the motherboard to the RAM sticks, all that good stuff. Lighting on the desk and the case, just RGB taking over. And I have to admit, it does look awesome. I have it in my case, but if you're on a budget and you're going to spend $150 on 16 gigabytes of 2133 megahertz of RAM, where you can take that same money and spend maybe about $60 or $70, depending on the market, for the same amount of RAM, just no RGB, then why don't you just do that? I get it, you want it to look cool, but if you're on a budget, you don't really need that RGB. Speaking of RAM, some people think that just because you have 32 megahertz of RAM that you're gonna have the best gaming performance ever, and it's slightly true, but compared to somebody who has maybe 2133 megahertz of RAM, which is the default memory for a DDR4, you're not really gonna have that much of a change when it comes to performance in a game. Alright, this claim has been set many times, and you don't really need high speed of RAM just to have a good game. And the same can go for the capacity. 8 gigabytes is just fine for any game out there today as of this recording. Now yes, 16 gigabytes will help for smoother gameplay, but if you're just trying to play a game, 8 gigabytes is just fine. Alright, sticking with the gaming here, I see a lot of people throw in S299 or S399 platforms, and honestly, if you're just gaming, you don't need it. Now, if you're a content creator or maybe even a streamer, and I mean like a hardcore streamer, like you Twitch maybe constantly, you want that 1080p on your side and on the receiving side, or someone who uses virtual machines, then these platforms really aren't for you. They're designed for people who want to take the full advantage of the CPU. And right now, games are just not using the full advantage of CPUs. Alright, you can be easily happy with a R7 1700 or i7 7700K, or even 6700K, honestly, and you will be just fine. You don't need these expensive platforms just to have a good game. Think about it. You're paying $200 to $300 for a motherboard, $600 to $1,000, $600 to $1,000 just for a CPU, which you're not going to take advantage of if you're only gaming. Alright, so just think about it. Next is having that high-end GPU. Now, I get it, you want your game to look as pretty as possible. You want to play on ultra settings. You want that high FPS counter, which honestly, the FPS counter shouldn't be turned on unless you're troubleshooting your games. If the game itself looks beautiful, without the FPS counter, then leave it off. You don't really need it. But I digress. Shouts out to Jay for that one. If you enjoy your games and you really don't care how they look, then you don't need to spend a large amount of money on a GTX 1080 or a Vega 64. Alright, just get something simple like a RX 580 or a GTX 1060 if you can find it for a good decent price. You don't really need to go above and beyond to get a great gaming experience. Now again, if you want it to look pretty, then yeah, but if you can't really afford it, then don't go for it. And another thing is, don't compromise, alright? If you can get a GTX 1080, but you can only get an i5 processor, then don't go that route. If you can get the GTX 1070 and get an i7, then go that route, because it's easier to upgrade a GPU than it is a CPU. If you have to make a choice between a high-end GPU and a high-end CPU, go for the CPU first and then get the GPU, alright? Not to mention, a high-end GPU doesn't mean anything if you don't have the monitor to support what's given out from the GPU. So if the GPU can handle all of those frames and it's sending it to your monitor, or maybe your monitor can't refresh but so often, alright? If you only have a 1080p monitor with 75 Hertz, you're not going to really benefit from a GTX 1080 Ti. It just doesn't make sense. A lot of misconception I hear, or that I see when, you know, people send me their list, is having an SSD or an M.2 NVMe. When you have an SSD, alright, the game will load faster, alright, that's a given. But it doesn't mean the performance of the game after it's loaded will be able to be improved. You know, maybe you get a slight improvement, but nothing really noticeable. And the reason for this is because the game is already loaded. So you don't really need an SSD to improve games any further, because the game is already loaded into memory. Alright, and just because you have an NVMe doesn't mean you're really going to take advantage of it. Unless you transfer files constantly from one end to the next end, you don't need an NVMe. Alright, a nice SSD or a SATA M.2 will be just fine. The Samsung 850 EVO is a great SSD to have. Hell, I still have my 750 EVO and it's still kicking, you know. Now mind you, I did catch it on sale from Amazon for about $120 and it's 500 gigabytes. I couldn't turn that down. But the fact of the matter is, I have a older gen SSD and it's still kicking, it still meets my demands. Now maybe your demands may be a little bit higher, but if you're only gaming, you don't need a high-speed SSD. It's honestly, it isn't really necessary for gaming, that is. Next is Windows 10 Pro. And I get it, I was the same way back in the day. If there was a Pro or Enterprise Edition or something, I had to get it, or I had to look into it. And you know, it's cool and all, but just because you want it doesn't mean you need it. And hear me out. Here are some things in Windows 10 Pro: Bitlocker, remote desktop, joining a domain. Alright, now does those sound like things that you really need for your home computer, especially if it's just one computer? Alright, now Bitlocker, I get it, you may want to encrypt your hard drive, but there are things that you can do to encrypt your hard drive, so you don't really need Bitlocker. A remote desktop, you don't really need that, because Teamviewer is free and works great, and you can use it from any other device, especially your phone, so you don't need that. And joining a domain, if you have a domain in your home, then you know you're probably not watching this video. And if you don't know what a domain is, then you don't need Windows 10 Pro. Windows 10 Home Edition is just great. It offers the same amount of things that Windows Pro has, minus those things I just mentioned, and it's again works exactly the same. So you don't need a Windows 10 Pro. So save the money, get the home edition and call it a day. Next is the aftermarket cooler with a lock CPU. Now I get it, you don't want a hot CPU, nobody wants a hot CPU, but the stock coolers are designed for these lock CPUs. So even if you do a lock, it will still keep it cool. Now I get it, it may be a bit loud, but it's included with the CPU, so you really can't complain. So if you're spending $25, $35, or even $50 on a aftermarket cooler, you can save that money, put it somewhere else, maybe towards a monitor or a GPU or another CPU, and you can just use that instead. All right, you don't need to buy an aftermarket cooler when the stock cooler works just fine. All right, especially with the Intel lock coolers. Lock CPUs. You're not gonna overclock anyway, so you can't push it beyond what the CPU is capable of doing. So that stock cooler works just fine. Just get an air duster that's designed for electronics. Make sure you get all that dust out and you're good to go. You don't really need to get the aftermarket cooler. As long as you keep it clean, you're good to go. Speaking of a stock cooler, overclocking is not for everyone, and I get asked all the time, hey, I want the best performance, how do I overclock? And my response is always the same. It's trial and error. All right, not all parts are made equally. You know, some people may get a 5.0 gigahertz overclock, and some others may get a 4.7 gigahertz, but these can be the same exact parts, from the motherboard to the CPU to the cooler to the temperature to the thermal paste. Everything could be exactly the same. But if you're gaming, overclocking, yeah, it may help a little bit, but it's not really noticeable, unlike other applications like Premiere Pro or some rendering or Blender or whatever can use CPU heavily. All right, it's games really don't take advantage of the CPU unless, you know, it's like Ashes or Singularity or something like that. But majority of the time, games are not going to take advantage of the CPU. And if the CPU is good and the game is well optimized, then overclocking isn't really needed. All right. Now, I'm not saying don't overclock. You know, if you got an unlocked cooler, I keep getting those confused today. If you got an unlocked CPU, then yeah, overclock, get that performance that you're paying for. But if you don't know what you're doing, then just don't do it. You're okay with the stock settings. All right, now you can play around with it, just know that it can shorten the life of your CPU. And that's it, top 8 things that I think you don't need for a gaming PC. All right, if you agree with this video, please give me some thumbs up. If not, give me some thumbs down. But leave a comment. What things do you don't think you need in the CPU, or what things do you regret getting for your computer? All right, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell. It's your boy Rgb. I'm out of here. Peace.